everybody. Who wants to talk about inequality? I hope everybody, because that's what we're going to do. All right. So I want to talk about inequality in the United States, and I want to put inequality in the context of fiscal policy. Or rather, I want to talk about the story of the rise of inequality in the United States, the increasing levels of economic inequality that we're dealing with in the United States. And I want to talk about the role that fiscal policy has played in the rise of economic inequality. And specifically, I want to look at the progressivity of our tax system, right? That is to say, the extent to which we have a progressive tax system. And I want to talk about some of the programs that that tax system pays for. So anyway, hope that sounds good because it's what we're doing. So here, this chart here shows the declining share of income in the United States that goes to the bottom 50% of earners over the course of the last, well, almost 40 years now, and the increasing share that is going to the top 1%. Right here, you have basically the top 1% of earners in the United States doubled the share of income in the United States that they were receiving over the course of the years from 1980 to 2014. And the percentage of overall income that was going to the bottom 50% was basically cut in half. And I know this chart ends in 2014. I promise you, it's not going to look better for the bottom 50% when it goes all the way out to 2020. So this is income. We can also talk about economic inequality in terms of wealth. So income, obviously, income refers to the money that you earn, whereas wealth refers to how much stuff you own, right? How much money is in the bank? Do you own a home? Do you own a car? Do you have some other kinds of assets, right? So income is hopefully what you use to acquire wealth, if you're lucky. So I like this chart because it shows the extent to which inequality of wealth is maybe even larger than inequality of income, and it has increased over time at a more rapid rate than the inequality of income, right? So those who own a lot more than they used to, and those who own very little actually own less than they used to. So that's cool. So this, I like this chart. This zooms in here at the last 20 years. And again, you can see the same basic dynamic in this chart as well, right? You have here up at the top, you have the top 1% of wealthy households, right? The top 1% in terms of the amount of stuff they own. Their wealth has been increasing over the course of the last 20 years. Here we have, if we throw these folks in, this gives us the entire top 10% of wealthy folks in the United States. And right, and you can see that between the two of them, or between these two, right, the top 10% of wealth holders in the United States hold a great deal of the overall wealth, right, more than half, right? Here we have the top 10% of American households own 70% of America's wealth, which means that the bottom 90% of American households split 30% of the wealth between themselves. And the overwhelming majority of this wealth down here is owned by people who are in between the 50th and 90th percentile as far as wealth is concerned, right? People down here, the bottom 50%, they barely register at all. They have almost no wealth whatsoever. And as you can see from time to time, they do, in fact, completely drop off of our chart as they did after the Great Recession of 2008. Which, again, hit the bottom 50% of Americans much, much harder than it hit the top 10%, right? Actually, for the top 10%, the Great Recession was an excellent buying opportunity, as will the aftermath of the COVID-19 caused economic pause, unless somebody steps in to try to prevent very, very wealthy people from treating this as an excellent purchasing opportunity. Anyhow, good times. So where does fiscal policy then fit in with this story? Well, to start to answer that question, I want to show you this chart here. This is a chart that looks at top marginal tax rates starting from the creation of the federal income tax back in 1913 and running to 2018, right? And you can see that in the United States, we went through a period where we had very high tax levels on top earners, right? Remembering those tax brackets that we talked about earlier in the week, right? We taxed people at the top of the earning ladder at much higher rates. in the middle of the 20th century than we did at the end of the 20th century, or that we do here at the coming into the third decade of the 21st century. Right? Not only did we tax people at higher rates, we also had much higher. We had a whole lot more brackets. Right? That is to say, we broke down earners into much smaller brackets back in the middle part of the 20th century than we do now. Right? Nowadays we have only 7. Back here, you can have as many as 20 or 30. Right, and when I say so let's by the way, I love this chart. I think this is a really excellent sort of visualization of the decreasing progressivity of the American income tax system. Right, you see the system becoming less and less progressive over time. Right, this is with the top income brackets coming down and then eventually just going away entirely. Right, and then being restored, but still restored at a much lower level than what we used to have. So to put this into a little bit of context, let's go to, oh, by the way, on Canvas, I have a link to the article that this chart is drawn from. It's actually an interactive chart. So you can go in if you want to, and you can look at what all the brackets were and what the rates were for all of these different years. So let's look here at, this is 1957 here, right, during the Eisenhower administration. So in 1957, the top income bracket kicked in at $200,000, right? $200,000 was the beginning of the top bracket. And at the $200,000 bracket, the income tax rate kicked in at 91%. Right? 91% of income over $200,000 would be taxed at a rate of 91%, which means when you get to $200,000, when you get to $200,001, 91 cents out of that dollar is going to Uncle Sam, and you get to take home 9 cents with you. Just to put this into context, $200,000 back in 1957 would be about $1.85 million today. Right, so pretty close to $2 million is where that tax rate kicked in. So interesting thing about that is that, well, what do you suppose a tax rate of 91% says to, let's say, a CEO, somebody who's looking to get a generous package of compensation? What is a tax rate of 91% on every dollar that you earn above $200,000 say? It says, don't bother, right? It says, don't bother getting compensated this way because we're just going to take all the money, right? Which had what we call a downward pressure on incomes, right? It said to top earners, either find some other way of compensating yourself, either through stocks or investments, or don't pay yourself that much money. Pay that money to somebody else. Pay that money to your workers. So getting rid of that is one of the reasons why. Getting rid of that kind of pressure, getting rid of those high tax rates for top earners is one of the reasons why you see the growth of CEO compensation, right? Nowadays, CEOs here in the United States get paid at a rate of, pretty freaking close to 300 times what their average employees get paid, right? Part of that comes out of our tax system. It used to be, once upon a time, our tax system said, hey, don't bother trying to make $20 million a year. Nowadays, we say, dude, make as much as you want. And a lot of that, right? A lot of that increased share of the increased share of our national economic productivity, the increased share of that economic productivity that's going to people at the top, that's going to top earners, is coming out at the expense of people who earn paychecks. It's coming at the expense of average workers, right? And so this is what you see in this chart here, right? This looks at employees' share of gross domestic product. Right, what that means is how much of overall economic activity is going into the pockets of employees versus how much of it is going into the pockets of CEOs. And you can see here in the 20 years, really the last 20 years, there's been an almost 10% drop in the share of our overall economic productivity that goes to workers. This is another graph that shows basically the same thing, right? That productivity, it continues to increase. It used to be, once upon a time, that productivity and hourly compensation would increase alongside one another, but starting in the 1970s and then really accelerating through the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, you have just a complete decoupling of that. And again, fiscal policy isn't the only story here. It's not the only explanation, but it is definitely part of the explanation, and specifically the dramatic lowering of tax rates for top-level earners, which dropped from 90% down to 70% in the 1960s, and then from 70% to 30% in the 1980s. So far, so good. Does it make sense that lowering the amount of money that you tax top earners will encourage people to take bigger salaries if they can? And does it make sense that after, oh gosh, what has it been now? It's been 40 years or so of low taxes for top earners. After 40 years or so, that starts to feed into the accumulation, not just of income, but of wealth, which is part of what is leading to the wide disparities of wealth and income that we have here in the United States today. Cool? Cool. If it's confusing to you, shoot me a message and let me know, and we can talk about it. But I think this should make sense to everybody. So that's the progressivity side of things, right? As we can see that the disparities that we have, they line up pretty well with when we started to make our income tax system less progressive. Now, that's part of the explanation. And there are parts of the explanation for what's happening that don't have anything to do with tax policy, but since this is a unit on tax policy, we're going to focus on tax policy. So that's the progressivity side of things. And here now I want to talk about programs. And specifically, I want to talk about what are called tax expenditures. Tax expenditures, those of us who study public policy call these tax expenditures. If you ask politicians about this, they will call these things tax breaks or tax cuts. Right? Tax expenditures are basically programs that we have in place that tell people that if they do X, Y, or Z, they can either deduct that from their taxes or withhold taxes in some way. We call them tax expenditures rather than tax breaks because they really do work almost exactly like government spending. And here you can see this is as of 2018. As of 2018, we actually these tax expenditures taken all together were about the most expensive thing the federal government does, right? $1.4 trillion in tax expenditures. That's more than we spend on Social Security. It's more than we spend on Medicare and Medicaid. It's more than we spend on discretionary spending altogether, right? Adding up non-defense discretionary and defense discretionary. All of that together is less than what we spend on tax expenditures. Overwhelmingly, right, of the $1.4 trillion that we spent on tax expenditures, on tax breaks, 60% of that went to the top 20%. And almost 25% of all of those tax expenditures go to the top 1% of earners in the United States. Which is kind of crazy, right? This is one of the reasons why we call these programs a submerged welfare state, right? That is to say, it's government spending, basically, that goes primarily to the wealthy. And just to put this into context of some of the other programs that the federal government runs, SNAP, the SNAP program, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, aka food stamps, that costs about $57 billion a year, which would be here in the non-defense discretionary bucket. The entire budget for the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which oversees federal public housing, among other things, that has a total budget in 2018 of $52 billion. Our social welfare program that goes to poor people, it's a program called Temporary Aid to Needy Families. The entire budget for TANF, for our cash assistance welfare to needy people, the entire budget for that was $17 billion. Now compare that to some of these tax expenditure programs. One of these tax expenditure programs is something called the mortgage interest tax deduction. The mortgage interest tax deduction is a federal program that says that if you want to purchase a house and you need to take out a mortgage to purchase that house, the federal government will help you pay for the interest on the loan that you get from the bank. Right, which is basically a program for where the federal government says, hey, we'll pay you to take out a mortgage, right? We'll pay you to buy a house. We spend about $37 billion on that every year, which again is more than twice what we spend giving cash assistance to needy families. we spend $30 billion every year on favorable tax status for dividends. Dividends, or if you own stock in a company, dividends are what they give you at the end of every year if they're going to give you a share of their profits. The federal government doesn't tax that the way it taxes income. If it did tax it as income, it would earn the federal government an extra $30 billion every year. Another program that the federal government uses through tax expenditures is the federal government allows you to not pay taxes on money that you put into your 401k. Right now, what kind of people tend to have 401k plans? A 401k is a retirement savings plan. Oftentimes, as an employee, if you put money into this kind of savings program, your employer will match it, and both of you will be able to deduct the money that you put into that program from your taxes. What kind of people usually have 401ks? Usually fairly wealthy people. The federal government doesn't tax the money that goes into 401ks, and that every year costs about $72 billion, which is a lot of money, right? One of the biggest tax expenditure programs that we have is the exemption that we have for employers who pay for their employees' medical insurance. They get about $205 billion every year from the government to do that. Right, which again is a lot of money. We spend enough money through this through these various tax expenditure programs that if we got rid of them entirely, we would at the same time get rid of the budget deficit. Right? Right? To say that again, these tax expenditures we spend more on this than we do on with our budget deficit. Right? Our budget deficit got up to very nearly $1 trillion in 2019. I believe it was about $800 billion in 2018. Right? We would have had a budget surplus in the United States if we'd gotten rid of all of these tax expenditure programs, and the vast majority of these tax expenditure programs go to benefit the wealthiest Americans, which is awesome, right? Anyway, these are important things for you to know. We have a tax system that, although our income tax system is partly progressive, it's nowhere near as progressive as it used to be, and it doesn't work to compress wages the way it used to, which makes it easier for people at the very top of our economic system to siphon off much more of our economic productivity than they used to. At the same time, we've had the massive growth of these tax expenditure programs where the very, very wealthy give themselves tax breaks to pay themselves to do the kinds of things that they probably would have done anyway, like purchasing homes and save for retirement. Anyhow, good times. I thought I would share with you. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you will let me know if you have questions or comments. All right, talk to you next week.